Good evening, everyone. You're in the right place at the right time. This is Coast to Coast AM, and I'm George Knapp, your occasional host, coming to you tonight from the heart of the Mojave Desert. I hope you're pumped tonight because I certainly am. The person I consider to be the deepest thinker ever to broach these subjects that we cover on the program each week is Dr. Jacques Vallée. In my personal library at home, I probably have 2,000 books on the UFO subject and related stuff. I've got them stacked on shelves and in boxes in categories. But there's only one author who gets his own shelf, is his own category, and that's Jacques Vallée. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Vallée back in 1989, and we've had occasional contact since then. I've told you my opinion of his work, as I think it's the most important thoughts ever written on the subject. He has more than once changed the entire UFO paradigm, changed the direction of the research and the focus, or at least tried to. Once with a book called Passport to Magonia, which was the first to note the similarities between modern tales of UFOs and ETs and much older stories about fairies and goblins and lights and objects in the sky. And his newest book, co-written with Chris Abeck, is a perfect companion, I think, to Magonia. Wonders in the Sky, it's called. It looks at unexplained aerial objects from antiquity up until the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. And why are these old cases of any interest to anyone? I'll let Jacques Vallée explain that for himself. Jacques, great to have you here.
Good evening, George. Always a pleasure.
I had the pleasure of finishing the book yesterday. It's a wonderful book, and I hope a lot of people check it out. How do you sell this idea to a publisher? You know, you go in and say, hey, we're writing a book about UFOs, but we're only looking at cases that happened a long time ago and mostly in other countries pre-1900s.
It's not easy. It's not easy. But I think they remember Passport to Magonia, and there are publishers now who are knowledgeable about the subject and were intrigued with the approach that we took. And of course, when you start reading this material, it's like discovering a treasure. So I think the people at Torture Penguin caught on and became as enthusiastic as we were.
The argument could be made, and I'm sure it will be made by people who like to jump on this kind of stuff, that these cases are old. Some of them date back to like the 8th or 9th century. How do you give them any credence? There's no video. There's no photos. These were country bumpkins living in a non-technological age. Why should we even consider the cases?
That's the first reaction. If you remember, that's also the reaction people had initially to Passport to Magonia, that this is vague folklore. And, it's not vague folklore because, remember, these are the cases who went through history, down through history, all the way to us. And they were, for them to have been recorded the way they were recorded, they had to be felt to be very important to that civilization. The consuls in Rome made a rule that every year there had to be a record given to them of any unexplained object in the sky. And the reason for this was that they, for astrological reasons, it was felt that any strange object in the sky could announce new wars or the fall of empires, the fall of an emperor, and the birth of an exceptional person, and so on. Most of those, of course, were meteors and comets, which are very interesting to astronomers, because we can now go back and trace back the Halley's Comet, for example, all the way to the Roman Empire. But many of those were unexplained. It's a little bit as if, President Obama said to the Air Force, I demand to have a quarterly report on UFOs on my desk at the White House. And those were very important. Some of those records were lost, but many of them had been saved by historians who republished them in their own books, and we were able to trace them. We separated the explainable cases, again, the meteors, the aurora borealis, the comets, and so on, from those that remained unexplained. And those were felt to be very important. We have many records that come from the records of the churches in different countries and different civilizations. We go back to a couple of Egyptian cases that were actually engraved in stone. So for somebody to go to the trouble of erecting a stela in the middle of the desert, saying this is where, the Pharaoh and his army saw this strange object in the sky, that must have been felt to be very important. These are actually better authenticated and better described in many cases than what you read in the newspaper every day.
Plus, it's you have to consider what you're weeding out. You purposely stop in the 1890s at the onset of the Industrial Revolution, before there were balloons, before there were airplanes, so that there can be no mistaking any of these cases for something that humans are flying. It's also long before there was any kind of disinformation or Photoshop or anything of that sort.
Absolutely, and some of those cases came from people who were leaders in science or in the arts. Michelangelo, for example, saw a triangle in the sky and painted it. The painting is lost, unfortunately, but it's known from art historians that he saw this and felt it was important enough for him to do a painting of it.
You have some 500 or more cases. How'd you gather them all, and how do you sift through them and in selecting the ones that are most pertinent?
Well, it's very simple. It takes 6 years, and it takes a network. Of course, this was only made possible by the Internet. I could not do that. I published Passport to Magonia 40 years ago, and everybody has criticized it with good reason, because there were some inaccuracies in the book, but nobody has redone it, because it would be a lot of work to redo it. Let me tell you about my co-author, Chris Abeck, because Chris is, this book in many ways is his work. He took the initiative. He did most of the historical research. He's a scholar, much younger than I am. So in a way, this is a generation transition here. He represents, I think, a new generation of people doing this kind of research on the paranormal, especially in Europe, who have a completely different view of, the reality of the phenomenon and what it could mean. He's something of a cultural anthropologist and a student of history and language. He's an Englishman who lives in Madrid, and extremely precise in the research he does. And he contacted me because he wanted us to work to go over the material that I had started to nibble at in Passport to Magonia. When I wrote Magonia, I was well aware that I was just scratching the surface, that there must be scholars, there must be historians, museum curators, and so on, who were sitting on enormous reserves of information that was relevant. And, before then, I had pretty much followed the extraterrestrial approach. I mean, certainly my first contact with the problem was, we know there is life throughout the universe, there must be. And these objects look like spacecraft. Except that in science, you have to ask the question, when did it start? That's certainly one of the important questions, and it certainly did not start with Kenneth Arnold in 1947. It didn't start with the cloud cigars and the cigar-shaped objects in America during the 1897 wave, because we have records before then. So I started to look at this, but Chris had assembled a network of people, about 10 people, on the Internet, from Russia and Latin America and the U.S. and Germany and so on, who were digging up sources in the literature, and we merged our databases, his and mine, and then we started using his network to go after original sources. And here you have to realize that in the literature there are some references to old cases, but they are they don't give you the original source. They say, 2 discs flew over London in 1800 and so on. Well, if you go back to the original source, it says there were 2 lights seen over London. It doesn't say anything about discs. So if you want an accurate picture, you have to go back in as many cases as you can to the original record, and that's what Chris and his team did. And then we started working and accumulating this. For every case, we stopped at 500 cases between antiquity and 1879. And for every case we kept, we rejected 5 or 10 that were actually just lights in the sky or meteors or could have been anything. And so it was a labor of love. Once we started, the material is just so fascinating that you get just drawn into it. It's absolutely beautiful.
Of course, a central message here, and I'll let you express it, but one of the central themes is that the same things basically have been seen for a long time, basically throughout human history, though we might use different terms to describe them. The people back there, in some of the cases in your book, refer to flying shields, not flying saucers. They talk about in China flying dragons, reflecting sort of cultural values of the time and place. Are these cases... Do you think these cases are reporting the same things that we see and report now, just describing them differently, or do you think these objects appear in different forms to reflect the times?
In this book, we're very careful not to... We don't even propose any theory. We just wanted to go over the material and put it before other scholars. We see this book as a beginning. In a way, Passport to Magonia was a beginning, but this is really a new beginning. We hope to alert. There must be a lot more that we haven't discovered. One of the beauties, of course, of the Internet today, and you know I'm a great fan of the Internet professionally, is that museums and newspapers and archives and so on are putting all their collections now online. So it's a lot easier to search through that material than it was, even 10 years ago. So we've actually done the best we could at producing this, but there must be a lot more. There must be, in the attics of castles in Germany and Austria and France and Britain, there must be piles of records and manuscripts and correspondence that should be looked at. And so we're trying to alert librarians and scholars and historians to note that material and record it and bring it to our attention. Also, of course, we're much better at reading French and English or German than reading, ancient Chinese or ancient writing from Japan. So we need to enlist the energy and the scholarship of people, of researchers in Asia and in other places in the world. So that's what we hope the book will do. It will be a beginning. When we analyze the patterns in these 500 cases, the patterns that emerge are absolutely similar to patterns we extract from contemporary databases. And that's where we're tempted to say this is the same phenomenon, it's always been with us.
You assert in the book that alien contact might be mankind's oldest story, that these incidents have always been with us in one form or another, and that they have changed the course of history in some cases. Can you give examples?
Certainly, and it's not just me saying that. I'm just quoting scholars like Professor Culiano at the University of Chicago, who spoke of the travel to the stars as the oldest story of humanity. There was what I love particularly the stories from China, because the people who wrote those records, of course, were the scholars and the poets. Most of there's one from the 13th century, for example, June 3rd, 1277 in China. Strange event seen at dawn. And this was written by Liu Ying, who was a Chinese poet of the Yuan dynasty. And his book was called the Yuan Literature Collection, Event Seen at Dawn. I rise at dawn, and through the window I see a very bright star that crosses the Milky Way. Now I see 3 luminous objects appear in the southern sky, of which 2 fly away and disappear suddenly from my sight. The one which remains possesses 5 unequal lights beneath it. You're beginning to see that this is not an ordinary light in the sky. And above its upper part, I see something in the form of a dome. The unknown object begins to move in zigzag, like a dead leaf. Well, if you remember, we have lots of stories. One of the characteristic motions of modern UFOs is a dead leaf motion. It continues. At the same time, some fiery thing falls from the sky. A short time afterwards, the sun rises, but its brightness is dulled by the luminous object that moves quickly in a northerly direction. So by now, it must have been in the sky for a fairly long time. So this is not just a passing thing in the sky. In the western sky, a green cloud is suddenly disturbed by another unknown object, oval in shape, flat, that descends quickly. This object is more than 3 meters long and is surrounded by flames. It rises again shortly after its descent. In view of this splendid and amazing spectacle, I rush to the village to alert the inhabitants. When my friends come out of their houses, a flying machine has disappeared. After the event, I reflect on it very much, but do not find a reasonable explanation. I have the impression I have come out of a long dream. I hasten to write down all that I have seen at the time so that whoever understands these events can give me an explanation. Well, this is 13th century China, okay? I get letters like this from readers of my books today. Exactly, almost the same words. I have the impression I've come out of a dream. I have no reasonable explanation. Please explain this to me. I wrote it down as I saw it. It's a completely modern description.
As you note in the book, these things are described as omens and portents here and there. They can, in fact, change the course of history in some cases. They
were seen, of course. Anything in the sky at that time was interpreted by people, usually official astrologers and so on. Certainly in the early centuries, as announcing things or being guided by God, by whatever God, they were worshiping.
You say that you would like to invite a whole new generation of researchers to become involved in this. Maybe by the end of the program, we can tell anybody in our audience, if they're interested in helping to contribute, how they can contact you or Chris, your co-author, and how, in fact, they can contribute, because it sounds like you need a lot of foot soldiers to get this done.
Yes, and we need people who speak Japanese and Chinese and people who can read ancient Egyptian and so on, but we're very much aware that we're just at the beginning of this.
We are just beginning our interview with Dr. Jacques Vallée about his wonderful new book called Wonders in the Sky. When we come back, we'll jump into some specific cases, including some of the biblical events that have been described as perhaps UFO incidents over the years. Stay with us on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back, everyone. My guest, Dr. Jacques Vallée, here to talk about his new book called Wonders in the Sky. He looks at cases, UFO cases, from antiquity to the advent of the Industrial Revolution. Here's one of them. October 14th, 1253 in England, Nicholas of Findurn reported to Burton Abbey that about an hour of Vespers, the sky being clear, suddenly a large bright star appeared out of a black cloud with two smaller stars in the vicinity. A battle royal soon commenced, the small stars charging the great star again and again, so it began to diminish in size, and sparks of fire fell from the combatants. This continued for a considerable time, and at last the spectators, stupefied by fear and wonder, and ignorant of what it might portend, fled. Not exactly a meteor sighting, not exactly a swamp gas, an amazing case from long, long ago, and this book is filled with them. We'll talk about some of those cases, including biblical-type cases, when we come back with our guest, Dr. Jacques Vallée, here on Coast to Coast AM. Before the break, my guest, Dr. Jacques Vallée, commented that he hopes that this book will provide an impetus for a whole new generation of scholars, scientists, historians, anthropologists to become involved in collecting these stories and putting together a comprehensive long-term view of it. However, in his book, Wonders in the Sky, he writes, "So why hasn't science taken notice, given the robust nature of the phenomenon and the enormous interest it elicits among the public? You'd think that interdisciplinary teams of historians, anthropologists, sociologists, and scientists would rush to study it." And then he notes that Stephen Hawking makes this wisecrack where he says, "I'm discounting reports of UFOs. Why would they appear only to cranks and weirdos?" Jacques, how do you overcome that? You've been at this for 40 years and plugging away and doing really good work, solid, scientifically grounded work, and yet the mainstream guys still don't come around to this thing.
Well, I've been at it more than 4 years, as you have, George, and Stephen Hawking is somebody I admire enormously. He's one of the great astronomers, one of the great cosmologists of our time. He just hasn't looked at the material, and that's very typical of a lot of the academic community. They have not been exposed to the actual data. And I hope that, eventually, I hope that he and his colleagues will take the time to look at this. I'm encouraged by the fact that now, pilots are coming out and telling their stories, military people, as in the book by Leslie Kean recently, that people are no longer afraid of telling their stories, and you find that they come from people who are not weirdos and cranks. And certainly in this material, in these 500 cases, most of them came from official people, from people who were advisors to kings. In some cases, came from the king and his officers. And I think that it's just a matter of putting that material before people, so that they can judge by themselves.
So anybody who looks at it with an open mind can't help but be impressed and be interested.
Well, they would. Again, they don't have to buy into any particular theory. We're not smart enough, I think, at this point, to have a theory that really accounts for all of this material. It's very complex. It's very difficult. We don't have all the data. But, for example, there is November 1st, 1461, in France, in Arras. The witness is Jacques Duclair, legal advisor to Philippe III. He writes, quote, "On this day of our Lord, All Saints' Day, there appeared in the sky an object as bright as burning steel, as long and wide as half of the moon. It was stationary for 15 minutes. Well, what was it? I mean, it wasn't a meteor, it wasn't a comet. Suddenly, the strange object began to spiral upwards, and then it spun around and rolled over like a loose watch spring, after which it disappeared in the sky." Now, he publishes this in the memoir of Jacques Duclair about the reign of Philippe le Bon, Duke of Burgundy. This was published in Brussels in 1836. Okay, so you just have to trace, and this is where Chris and his team were remarkable. They traced back all these cases one by one and did the critical analysis. And by the way, there are lots of stories. You hear people will come to me and say, well, what about India? What about the Vedanta? They talk about the legend of God flying around in machines. What about the Hopi have a tradition of a beautiful maiden coming down from the sky in a basket and so on. Well, that's fine, but those are stories. They have tremendous cultural significance, but I can't do very much with them as a scientist. We made the rule that we would only take cases that had a date and hopefully a time and a place, and in many cases the name of the witness. And most of our cases have all of that. We relaxed the rule in the early centuries, but after the 13th and 14th century, we enforced the rule that we wanted a precise date and a precise place. We're not dealing with legends and, cultural traditions and so on. We're dealing with actual recorded facts.
Well, you've got one of the oldest ones, and I was asking you before the break about cases that might have affected human development, human culture. One of the oldest ones you cite on page 29 of your book is in the Nile Valley of Egypt, 1347 BC, and this involved the Pharaoh Akhenaten, who had his own experience, saw this thing float down. It was described as a shining disc, and you don't see the disc description in throughout the 500 cases that you have here, but this guy actually described it as a disc. He went on to found a new religion based on the worship of what he called the solar disc, and basically established his immortality. That's a big one.
Yes, he founded a new civilization, and a new religion, and this is actually recorded again in a stela. And again, in those days, of course, there was no paper, and important events like that were actually engraved in stone, and that's how they have come to us. So that shows, again, how important people felt that it was and how relevant it was to their history and their society.
How much weight do you give to cases in the Bible that you don't have a specific date, you know approximately when it might have happened, but you know that it's been rewritten over time by different scholars, biblical scholars? The prophet Elijah, for example, you mentioned that he had an experience in 850 BC or around there.
Yes, and the most significant, I think, from the events described in the Bible is probably Ezekiel, because Ezekiel is very detailed. There are different interpretations of what he wrote, and of course what we have in the Bible was written centuries after Ezekiel's death, but it was written from the tradition that he left and that crossed the centuries. What he describes is very interesting because he uses words that are used only once in the Bible, and he even uses a word that's used only once in the language of the time. So he was obviously very distraught and very disoriented by what he saw. It's a classic abduction. And by the way, people studying abduction believe that abductions were started recently, and I'm sure you've interviewed some of these authors, that it's a recent phenomenon and it shows a new phase in the phenomenon. And that's not true. I mean, abductions go back. There are many cases of abductions in our chronology, in our records. Ezekiel was transported to a faraway mountain, and he was in shock. And what he describes were wheels within wheels, and he describes 4 beings that left him completely confounded. I should mention that the book, I think, some of the richness of the book comes from the fact that Chris and I didn't agree on everything, which is always healthy in science. Chris is a much more precise and exacting scholar than I am. And we had discussions, not fights, because I really admire what he does, but we had strong discussions and arguments about some of the cases. I was more willing to include cases where we didn't have all the documentation, all the references, and even cases that didn't actually include an object per se, but some form of contact with a non-human voice or a non-human form. And he insisted that we should only focus on aerial objects as opposed to more vague phenomena, and that we should always have a reference. We compromised, and in the book you'll see a little I with a circle around it, which means this is a case where we need more information. And it's really an appeal to the reader or to people who have more information to help us. I won some of those arguments because I said, look, we know that there may be a case here. If we don't call it to the attention of people, we'll never know more because people are not going to go back and do the research. So it's our duty to publish it, but with a note of caution that we don't know as much as we wanted to about this particular case. In some cases, we don't have a complete reference. So that's how we compromised. And obviously, in a case like Ezekiel, we have to say that we are not in a position to make a complete statement about it. Many of the other cases, we are in such a position because we have traced it to the actual original record.
Well, your comment about abductions and how far back they go is well taken. Looking through this book, I'm amazed at how far back they go and how widespread they are. There's a case from the year 760 in France where the witnesses see this aerial ship battle, these ships fighting it out in the sky, and 4 of these guys are abducted by aerial beings. And there are other stories in the book about during the Inquisition, the period of the Inquisition, abductions happened, and of course, given the times, people associated the events with witchcraft, and there were some tragic results, figuring anybody who gets abducted and is consorting with people in the sky must be a witch, let's burn them.
Yes, right? Exactly. And in, of course, in the Arab tradition, many of these beings from the sky were called the jinns, or the jinni, or the jinn. And, of course, that tradition is very interesting, also from a cultural and religious point of view.
What do you make of these aerial battles? Because we see that in France, in this case in 760, with the Indian example that you talked about. Ancient India had these giant battles. In England, they had giant battles. What are these people seeing? And, of course, I know you don't want to get into theories because you don't do that in the book, but just speaking as Jacques Vallée and not as the co-author of this thing.
Well, it's very puzzling, and Chris and I have had many discussions back and forth about this. Of course, there are cases even in the U.S. of UFOs engaging in what people describe as dogfights. I remember seeing cases like that in the Blue Book fight. So it may be just a description of erratic movements of objects in the sky that are interpreted as a battle. In other cases, we just don't know what they saw. And I'm sure that the book will be criticized, if not attacked, by historians, and in a legitimate way, saying, look, a sighting in the 7th century in France is not on the same level, on the same playing field as something in the 17th century, in Germany. And we know that. So we've divided the chronology 1 century at a time, with an introduction and an epilogue for every century, summarizing what was going on in that particular period, culturally, in terms of communication, the invention of paper, for example, the invention of the printing press, the invention of the telegraph, the different modes of communication, patterns of urbanization, and so on. I mean, we are not completely ignorant of those things, and that communication in the 17th century was not what it was, in the Dark Ages. And so we try to place these descriptions in their linguistic and cultural context as much as we can, and obviously put it in a modern language, but in a modern interpretation, but without losing the framework.
I want to mention this case in particular. I guess maybe you owe a debt of gratitude to Saint Agobard in France, 815, because he wrote about Magonia and these abductees from Magonia. And apparently the stories of abductions and things in the sky were so common that sort of an underground theory had developed among the people that there must be a place called Magonia where all these ships come from. And this guy wrote, oh, no, don't believe that. That's crazy. You can't believe in a place called Magonia, right?
Well, Agobard was a remarkable man. He was one of the great scholars of his time, wrote 22 books in Latin. He was the Archbishop of Lyon in the 9th century, played an important political role after the death of Emperor Charlemagne, was exiled for a while and came back to Lyon. The Archbishop of Lyon was almost as powerful as a king. So he carried considerable weight, and he wrote books against superstitions. He was, in a way, he was a rationalist, even though he was an archbishop. And in one of his books called About Thunder and Lightning, he says that the people of his district were so crazy that they thought there was this unknown land above the clouds called Magonia, where these ships were coming from. And that one day the people brought to the church 4 humans in chains, 3 men and 1 woman, who had come down from one of those flying ships. And obviously, as you said, they must be witches because they came from a flying ship. So they wanted to kill them, and he preached to them and said that there couldn't be flying ships, that this was a complete superstition, and that they should let these people go. And so he, in a way, saved their life because he was a non-believer in UFOs. So it shows that skeptics can be useful sometimes.
You know, a lot of these things that appear in the sky, they do take on religious overtones. People think of them as a religious sighting. There are instances mentioned in your book, including one from Italy in the year 1001, where somebody sees these strange lights and then a luminous lady. They figure it's got to be Virgin Mary. That pops up a lot, where things are seen in the sky and they are given religious import, whether or not it fits or not.
Well, one of the secret pleasures, sinful pleasures of working with this material is to look at how people explained it, because there was always some wise guy in the crowd who had an explanation. Usually they would go to, a great scholar or a religious leader, and he would say, well, this thing represents, the Pope, and this other thing represents our bad king, and it shows that, religion will triumph, or it shows that England will be defeated, or it shows that people should pray and renounce their sins. They had all these explanations, just like, the Air Force today, explaining it as, it must be the planet Venus, even though it was seen in the north, or it must be some comet, even though it crossed the sky in 10 minutes, So it's one of the secret pleasures.
It's in a way, it's like the precursor to disinformation. The church had its own version of Phil Klass back in the Middle Ages or something. Oh, yeah, this is God's work here. You better straighten up and tie to the church or something like that, or using these kinds of cases to get the people in line.
Yes, but when you go back to the actual record, you find that it's absolutely similar or parallel to what people are seeing today, which we still can't explain.
Well, that's what I wonder, and I know you maybe don't want to get into that in a discussion with the book itself, but the idea that maybe we are seeing the same things, but they were seeing the same sort of things, but the appearances took it on a different form. And I know that's entirely speculative in our part, that maybe whatever this is, this entity, this intelligence, it appears to us in different forms. And we'll get into that after this break, continuing our fascinating discussion with Dr. Jacques Vallée about his new book, Wonders in the Sky. Don't go away, everyone. We'll be right back with more Coast to Coast AM. Whether you call them wheels or orbs or discs or flying dragons, there are 500 or more cases in this new book, Wonders in the Sky by Jacques Vallée. And it's amazing as you read these cases how often these things seem to appear to what we would call great people, a pharaoh, the Chinese emperor, Alexander the Great, Michelangelo, and even to Jacques Vallée himself. You will have to wonder as well if that's on purpose, if it's some sort of a display. We'll get into that with Jacques Vallée as soon as we come back after this break on Coast to Coast AM. Thanks for being with us. We're talking with Jacques Vallée about his new book, Wonders in the Sky, and it's amazing the descriptions of different craft and objects that are seen in the sky over these 500 cases in hundreds of years. A case from 1752 in Russia about someone who was abducted in a, quote, flying cauldron. Another one from the same year in Norway of a flying octagon. One from 1745 London, a flying trumpet, and 1748 Scotland, globes of light. All kinds of different descriptions. And what amazes to me, as I teased a couple of minutes ago, how many of these cases involve great leaders, great people from history, a pharaoh, a Chinese emperor. Alexander the Great had one or more instances. Michelangelo, as Jacques mentioned, and Jacques, I should say that you've had your own case. Do you think that is an accident, that these things appear to what we would call great people?
Well, I think it's simply the filter of history. That if it appeared to some peasant somewhere, probably the person would not have been able to read and write in those years, and the ones that come to us because they appeared to a king or to a pharaoh or to a bishop were recorded because he was surrounded by scholars and clerks and people who could write. I think those are the ones that have survived and were felt to be important.
I should point out that although you've written a lot of UFO books, you are by no means a UFO believer, not in the classic sense. I mean, you believe there's a legitimate phenomena there, but you have really put it to the mainstream UFO community over the years, suggesting that some of their central theses are flat out wrong. We, as you have said, we don't exactly know what it is, this intelligence, but you were the first to write that probably the vast amount of these incidents and cases belie the theory that the ET explanation is the best explanation, that it just doesn't seem to make sense. In looking at these 500 cases from years gone by, did they affect your views in that regard? Did they alter your views about what it might be?
That is obviously was a frequent topic of discussion between Chris Abeck and me. He has a more detached, I think, view of that. He should speak for himself. But in my interpretation of his position is a little bit more cautious. What I'm criticizing is the first degree, the first level ET explanation. I mean, that these are spacecraft that come from some other planet and they come here to save us or to conquer us or to steal materials from us and so on. I mean, that is the first thing you can think of when you begin to study this material. And the first two books I wrote back in the 60s, in the mid and late 60s, took that approach. And it's always, as I said, we know that there must be life equal or superior to our consciousness, to our intelligence, throughout the universe. It's a big cosmos out there, and I studied astronomy and I still love astronomy, and now we keep discovering new planets, including planets similar to the Earth. So that only reinforces that view that was controversial in the 60s, but now it's mainstream. It's about time. However, when you look at the patterns, which as a scientist, a theory is only as good as the explanations that it provides for the facts. And when we look at the observations themselves, it doesn't account for what people are reporting. People are not reporting a spacecraft. They're reporting a whole range of phenomena, and there is no simplistic explanation. And if anything, doing this work in the last 6 years on the ancient sightings has sort of nailed that for me, that there is no simple explanation. It's not, chariots of the gods. It's not something like that, as seductive as it could be. However, that doesn't mean that they are not from outer space, or that form of consciousness doesn't have a link beyond the Earth. I mean, if they can do, in the hypothetical they, in quotes, they can do what the witnesses described. That could be from anywhere, anytime. They have obviously mastered gravity. They have mastered time beyond what our science can account for today. Now, I'm a strong believer in science. I think science eventually will understand all this. I could be wrong, but it's not a simple spacecraft where you can just go there and kick the tires. At the center of any theory about UFOs, whether it's a paranormal, parapsychological, Jungian, and so on, you have to account for the fact that there is a machine there. There is a technology, and I've never said otherwise. That's really why I continue to be interested. I mean, I'm very interested in the physics of it. In my current work, I've narrowed down my work to just a few cases that involve traces, involve material, involve electronic communication, things that we begin to make sense of in a somewhat primitive way. But we've collected. There is material that has been recovered after some of the close encounters that we can analyze. We're beginning to find some patterns in the physics. We're beginning to have some ideas about the electromagnetic communication, or at least the electromagnetic phenomena that surround these things. And little by little, we're converging on a pattern, or at least not an understanding yet, but at least a model of what that technology can be, but it's not all there is. There is much more than just technology involved, and that's what you see in, even, these ancient Chinese writers and poets were talking about a machine. They were talking about a contraption of some sort. And there were descriptions of things crashing to the ground. There were descriptions of traces. There are descriptions of medical effects, paralysis, intense heat when the object flew over them, certainly medical effects and certainly psychological effects that are similar to what current witnesses, modern witnesses, are describing to us.
You are familiar, of course, with this ranch in Utah where we've written something about it, and these different phenomena appear to different people at different times. It seems like whatever it is, it decides when it's seen, where it's seen, and who gets to see it, almost as if it's a display, a show. In your writings over the years, you've written that it seems to be, one theory being, that it's almost like a control system, that whatever it is, it keeps us under control in ways by appearing at different times to different people. It in effect, intervenes in the course of human affairs. And you have said that this control system theory that you have is testable. And I'd like to know if you ever tested it. And if not, is that still doable?
Well, I didn't mean necessarily that there was an intelligence, a supreme intelligence controlling it or directing it. The phenomenon has the information characteristics of a control system. It comes in waves. It responds to certain things. I've never published this, but I will someday. As you know, one of the things I want to leave behind is a record of my own research called Forbidden Science, and I've published 2 volumes so far, and they are, sort of not widely published, but they are on record, and I want to continue to do that. In the 90s, I tried to create sort of an artificial thing like the ranch in Utah, and this was, of course, before the events at the ranch. I tried to create a hotspot of information where I was hoping to sort of attract the phenomenon to be able to record it better. And it didn't give the results I was hoping for. It's not something that you can just decide to engage with, or at least I haven't found a way to do it. But it's worth continuing to try because there seems to be a form of consciousness behind it that is extremely subtle, has a great sense of humor, is completely ruthless. I mean, I know from reading your book, what, and actually being there, what happened at that ranch. There is no simplistic explanation.
And not just at the ranch, in general, across the world. I mean, this thing is, it toys with people, it messes with their minds, and you always have to wonder what the heck kind of agenda is going on here, if there is even an agenda at all.
Well, I studied physics, but I certainly don't consider myself a physicist. I'm trained in information science, and in information science and logic, you often have situations, well, even in mathematics, where you have contradictions in the material you're looking at. And the solution is to go up a level. It's not to fight it and try to force it into a preconceived idea. It's certainly true in mathematics. That's why, imaginary numbers were invented. There are no imaginary numbers. But when you invent the concept, it enables you to do things in mathematics about real things that you couldn't do before. So I think that's probably what we will have to do with this, is go up a level, not be so fascinated by the day-to-day cases and the sightings and the databases, which are, of course, you need to do, but you need to go up and take a wider view of this, and I think that's very much what the direction that Chris is going. Chris is going to write, many more books. He has amazing material in many areas of this, and he'll continue to publish it, I hope. One of the remarkable things in this book is when you get to the 17th and 18th century, you get to the Enlightenment. And then you find that the witnesses are astronomers. Some of the greatest names in science, Arago, Messier, the discoverer of what is now known as galaxies, the Messier objects, Cassini, the director of Paris Observatory. Of course, Arago was director as well. Le Verrier, who discovered Neptune. All of them were involved in this, in looking, actually inviting people to send them observations of unknown objects in the sky. The science was open. It was, of course, in those days, it was great glory for an astronomer to attach his name to a new phenomenon. And scientists were completely open to the idea of there is correspondence between astronomers and the mathematician Gauss, for example, about objects that were very puzzling to them. There are descriptions by Lagrange of a series of objects moving through the sky in military fashion and turning together. And those were not just, a train of meteors. Cassini made 2 observations of something that seemed to be in orbit near Venus. And he didn't publish, again, these were careful scientists. He didn't publish it because he was the only one who had seen it, and he only published it when he saw it a second time a few years later. Now, these are careful men who've attached their name to some of the great discoveries of the 18th century, and there you are. I mean, these are the records that we have forgotten, and when you see the academic arrogance that we encounter today of people just not even wanting to look at the records, even the records from pilots or records from the Air Force or from the Navy, they just won't even look at it. They will dismiss it with out of hand, with ridicule. The science has fallen to a terrible level of arrogance.
And of course, as you know, these days, the critics, the ultra-skeptics and die-hard debunkers, they like to say that no scientists ever see this stuff, astronomers never see this stuff, and it looks like we've gone backwards instead of forwards, at least in this regard, from the days of the Enlightenment that you describe in this book.
Yes, absolutely. It's a shame.
And scientists today, it seems like there's a gap between what the religion that they have embraced and the reality of what millions of people around the planet see. Now, of course, as you know, 95% of what people see in the sky is explainable, but that other 5% gets dismissed altogether, and nobody wants to hear about it. Don't even want to look at it.
Well, and that's, I think, culturally very dangerous because people know that. So they, if an educated person sees something in the sky, they don't want to be laughed at by some astronomer who's going to ridicule them or dismiss them. So they don't report it, or they, hopefully they will report it to someone like me or somebody who's been publishing research on it, or contact some of the UFO groups. But most witnesses today just keep it to themselves.
I do want to say, you mentioned your 2-volume work, Forbidden Science. I had read the first volume some years ago, and then last year, when I saw you, you were kind enough to give me a copy of the second one. And if people want to understand, I know this is not a book for the masses. It's sort of your personal journey of discovery. But if people want to understand how Jacques Vallée came to sort of where he is now and is thinking about these subjects, this is what you need to read. Forbidden Science Volume 2 is just an excellent book. And really, I'm surprised how candid you were about some of your thoughts and sharing your personal life with the readership.
Well, I think it has to be in the context of, the researcher's own path. In a way, this is also, a spiritual journey for me, and I feel, honored to be able to work on this with a small cadre of people, of scientists, and of researchers, of investigators like you, and try to make sense out of it. It's the greatest mystery that has been presented to us. And again, at the center, there is, I don't disagree with Leslie Kean or with Richard Dolan. I mean, he was kind enough to ask me to write a foreword to his first book. I don't disagree with their position that there is a technology there. The question, I think what I'm trying to contribute is the sense that there is no simplistic explanation. We shouldn't just jump to conclusions about this.
You get, you are a skeptic in many regards, and in this book, Wonders in the Sky, you take on a little bit Eric von Daniken, Zecharia Sitchin. I mean, I would imagine at some point, as you're looking at 500 cases from antiquity on up, that you had to cross paths with some of the same cases and incidents and evidence that these guys have interpreted in their own way, right?
Yes, I also crossed paths with Alexander Kazantsev in Russia, who was one of the originators of all of that. There we get to an area where I'm not really competent to speak, cultural anthropology and so on, and the history of religion. Chris and I, the book is in 3 parts, and what we've been talking about is the chronology itself, which is the first part, the largest one. But the second part looks at the cases that we've rejected, which includes a lot of cases that are in the UFO literature and, have to do with chariots of the gods and all those interpretations, many of which we dismiss because, again, it's a simplistic explanation. Of course, the gods can do anything if they could. They could come down here, but again, what the material we have doesn't reflect that kind of thing. It doesn't fit that theory, and a theory is only as good as what it explains. And at some point, you have to take a skeptical, not a cynical, but a skeptical view of it, and really dig into the material and ask. Try to explain it fully.
Skeptical is a good word. It's just been hijacked in our time, Jacques. We're going to take a break. We'll come back with more of our fascinating interview with Jacques Vallée, author of the new book Wonders in the Sky, right after this on Coast to Coast AM. And here on Coast to Coast, we're tangled up with a tangled web of ufology. It's perplexing, it's frustrating, and few people have been at it as long as Jacques Vallée. Few people have dug as deep or have tried to understand it more than Jacques Vallée, but somehow, the same issues, the same questions arise again and again, year after year, decade after decade, and you have to wonder if we will ever have any clear answers. Certainly, if we are going to have it, it's because of the work of people like Jacques. When we come back, we'll finish our discussion of Wonders in the Sky, his new book, and also bring it up to date with some of the current controversies in ufology and see what Jacques Vallée thinks about them. Stay with us for more Coast to Coast AM. Jacques Vallée, we've covered some of the highlights of your, I guess it's close to 60 years, 50 years that you've been chasing the UFO mystery and trying to figure it out. I wonder if this thought has occurred to you. A few people have been at it as long as you or have done as important work. Whether or not it will be ultimately frustrating for you if you don't have the answers during your time here. If you can't resolve the mystery in your mind, that's got to drive you crazy.
No. Science is never finished. I've had the privilege of working on a new phenomenon, or something that wasn't commonly recognized, and of making a contribution to it, calling it to the attention of people. I think I work every day with physicists and with doctors, with medical people who've been working on, cancer for 60 years, and we still can't cure cancer. We're making progress, and there are new theories and new hopes. The same thing in physics. I mean, we still can't reconcile relativity with quantum mechanics, especially with respect to gravitation. And that, you have to realize that these are difficult problems, and they take time. And we just, you're a worker like any other worker. You're never finished, and hopefully you make your contribution. You bring a little. I've seen during my career. I also had the privilege of working with some of the pioneers of the internet, with people like Paul Barron, who invented packet switching, people like Doug Engelbart, who did the first, arguably the first social network at Stanford Research Institute, where I was in the 70s, and I've told those stories. It's not finished. I mean, we still don't know what the ultimate, we're just at the beginning of the Internet and the web. We don't know what form it's going to take, in 20 years. But, the pleasure is having brought a few stones to the edifice. We're building something here. There is also, it's also a lot of fun. I think Chris and I were carried forward by, and the whole team, by just these extraordinary discoveries that we were making, including things that turned out to have been invented completely by some spurious author, where we could finally prove that the thing never happened. Things that turned out to be comets that had been quoted in the UFO literature for a long time. It ties to history, it ties to genealogy, it ties to a lot of extraordinary things. So, for example, in the first congressional hearings on UFOs took place on December 15, 1813. Some ufologists keep calling for congressional hearings. Well, they happened in 1813. There were lights seen over the shore of Connecticut, and of course there was a war going on between the United States and England, and the colonies in England at those days. And the question was, what were those lights? Was it created by traitors signaling to the English fleet? And there were very intense hearings and arguments in Congress about these unknown lights in the sky. And I think Decatur was involved in those discussions and so on. So you learn a lot about history and a lot about culture as you go through this.
And amazingly enough, Congress did not resolve the mystery of the unexplained lights back then or in the 60s.
Exactly.
Or now.
They don't seem to be doing a very good job of explaining it.
You have also jumped in head first, and on one level, I guess I should not be surprised, given your inquisitive nature, into another sort of cutting-edge phenomena, and that's remote viewing. We read a couple of years ago that you had done some training yourself, and I wonder I don't know how much you are willing to talk about that, but whether or not it has contributed to your understanding of the UFO phenomena.
Well, that's a whole other discussion, and
I know.
We could go into that at some point.
Okay.
I was at SRI actually before the remote viewing program started, or just at the same time. I was just in one of the computer departments working with Dr. Engelbart, who had invented the mouse. He had already invented all of that, so I can take no credit for it, but we worked together on the early days of the ARPANET. SRI had machine number 2 on the ARPANET. I don't need to tell you how many millions of machines there are today on the Internet. And so those were exciting days, and the remote viewing project was just a few offices away. And many of the, quote, psychics, for lack of a better term, had seen UFOs. So I became sort of a friend of the court, or an advisor to the program, even though at the time I was not cleared for the program, but I had many contacts with the psychics involved. I was cleared later in the 80s, but when I was at SRI, when Ingo Swann arrived, I had many discussions at lunch with Ingo, and was absolutely fascinated with the things that he was doing and demonstrating. And we talked about, I talked to him in terms of information patterns, because I deal with information. And in what it seemed to me that what he was doing was addressing information, except it was information that wasn't there, that was on the other side of the world, and transferring his consciousness in some mysterious way to those places. So I took him through a quick briefing or a course in information addressing from a computer point of view, and that's how the idea of coordinate remote viewing started. I didn't talk about it for a long time because when I was cleared, for Grill Flame in the 80s. Of course, this was a secret project, and I think I'm the only one who hasn't written a book about it. And by now, all of that, or practically all of it, has been declassified. So Ingo asked me to give a talk in Las Vegas a couple of years ago about those days, about the early days of the program, and I did. I think it's all over the internet now, so I have no problem talking about it.
Did you ever use remote viewing, and as so many remote viewers have done, encounter some kind of intelligence or see a UFO while you're in that state?
I have not. I have experienced, I was trained by Ingo. I'm not a very good remote viewer, but I'm good enough to understand what it is and what you feel and what it does. I remember a case where I was given a set of coordinates and instantly I had vertigo. And I was on top of a peak somewhere with a precipice all around me. It turned out to be the top of a very, very high mountain. And that came immediately, and I'll always remember that. And I had a number of experiences of that type. I think if I have any talent, it's not remote viewing. It's probably in some other area.
Let's, well, you know what? We'll have to have you back for an entire show about that. I'll twist your arm with that. Let's talk about some current developments in ufology that seem to pop up year after year. I want to get your take on them. You and I had the pleasure of meeting and interviewing Phil Corso back in the 1990s. We talked to him here in Las Vegas and also saw him in Florida, and he, of course, he's a credible guy, an interesting guy who told an incredible story about recovered technology being salted out into private industry. What is your take, not necessarily just on Corso, but on the whole crash retrieval stuff that our government has pieces of flying saucers somewhere?
Well,
do we not have enough time for that? I mean, in general,
I can give you a quick answer. I don't want to evade the question as much as I'd like to. But I was enormously impressed by Corso, by Phil Corso. I tend to be enormously impressed by anything who saved Europe from fascism. And there is no question he was a brave soldier. Made it clear to us that he was a soldier, not a physicist. So he did not know really what these things were. Colonel Alexander, and he's publishing a book in a couple of months that includes a very, very detailed intelligent analysis of the Corso statement. So I would really defer to Colonel Alexander for that.
Okay.
Because he went through his military history, where he had been, why he said some of the things he said, and so on. My impression was that Phil Corso was telling us the truth as he believed it.
Well, let me ask it in a more generic sense. Do you believe that our military, our government, has pieces of a flying saucer that's from somewhere else?
Well, Corso said a couple of things that are impossible. For example, about transistors. Well, I work every day with people. I mean, the invention of the transistor is within human memory. I work with people like Dr. Federico Fagin, for example, who is, right here in Silicon Valley and was the inventor of the microcomputer, the integrated circuit. I mean, all of that, we know the people who did it. Many of them are still alive. They didn't get it from Roswell. You can trace that technology through all its extraordinary technology. It happened very fast, but physically it made sense. I mean, every step is understood. And we have their laboratory notebooks. We know how they made the discoveries, where every experiment went, and so on. And we're still, of course, developing that technology. So the idea that came from Roswell makes absolutely no sense. The thing about fiber optic, well, it was known for a long time, even the 30s and before, that a wire of glass carries light. And in fact, it was used in art and it was used in instrumentation by glassmakers a long time before people thought about using it for fiber optic communication. So those things make no sense. I mean, the transistor was first described in the field effect was first described in a German patent in 1934. So there is a continuity there in human memory and human technology. That's just development of technology. What intrigued me the most about Phil Corso was his encounter with an entity in the desert. And that was something he did not understand, that made a profound impression in his life, and it's not in his book, because the people who actually edited his book thought that was a little bit too strange, and they wanted to stay within the dogma of crashed material and that kind of thing. The government, I don't know how, and there are people who do a good job of filing FOIA requests and digging into what the government must have known and so on, and about Roswell and other things. And I wish them well, and I'm glad that they have the
tenacity,
the courage and to do this. That's not something where I can contribute very much. I like to talk to, but this is a phenomenon that's all around us. You can talk to farmers who've seen the thing close by on their field, and I can go talk to them, and that's what I like doing. And many of them want to be anonymous because they don't want to talk to the media, they don't want to talk to the Air Force, they don't want the government involved, but they'll talk to people like me and to researchers. And so we have access to the phenomenon, even to pieces of metal that are found after some of these, and we can analyze them and so on. So I like this quiet Silicon Valley approach where you just do that work in stealth mode with your own resources. And I don't have the resources to do what should be done, which would be a larger scale study. So I concentrate on the things that I can do, which is looking at technology. Now, the government must have tons of records. We know that because we talk to pilots who say, when I landed, there were two guys there in blue jeans, and they confiscated all my material, and they took it somewhere, and they told me not to talk about it. So this must go somewhere. Now, it's not necessarily the CIA or the Air Force. We don't know where these guys in blue jeans come from. They violate many of the rules of handling of classified information. So who is it that can do that? I don't have the answer to that. I'm not so sure that it's a government agency, although we know, of course, that government agencies have accumulated stuff simply because they have sensors everywhere that are triggered by the phenomenon. So, of course, those people have classified clearances, and they can't talk to the guy in the next cubicle. So that's not the kind of research I can do. I'm not so hopeful that we can. I mean, obviously, the thing to do, and I've said that time and again, this stuff should be turned over to science, and let science compete. Let different labs and different teams come up with their best idea to do research on this in a competitive basis. I mean, that's the way the internet was built. That's the way we do research on everything else. I mean, what are they afraid of? What are they afraid of?
I guess ultimately they're not, and that's, I wanted to ask you one more question, your view on disclosure, because Rich Dolan and Bryce Zabel will be here in the next, at the top of the hour to talk about after disclosure, AD. You believe that there is some sort of a storehouse of information, perhaps in government hands, perhaps in private hands, that could be disclosed. Do you think it's going to happen? I mean, is there any impetus, anything that could force?
When people talk about disclosure, they don't talk about my disclosure.
Right.
The question is, disclosure of what?
Yeah.
These are usually, the mainstream ufology today believes that the government has a proof of contact with extraterrestrials, including perhaps bodies or maybe live extraterrestrials. Well, how do they know that? You have testimony from credible people who say that there is something like that. So, yeah, let's track it down. But the disclosure that I'd like would simply be turn the data that, strip it of any classified information. If it was a classified radar somewhere, I don't need to know how the radar works. But give us the data. Give us, just the facts, ma'am, and let science work on it. I don't think it's going to be very simple. It may take a couple of generations of scientists, but at least we will know. I mean, the public is not going to panic. In a case like this, it's the elites that panic because they're afraid of losing power. But the public, your audience, the people listening to us now, they can take it. I mean, they've thought about this. Many of them probably have seen things themselves. They know there's something there. There is more than what we see every day, around us. It's a big universe. So why are they so afraid?
Jacques Vallée, it's been wonderful to have you here. I sure hope that you will grace us with your presence again sometime, and wish you the best of luck. I encourage people to buy this book, Wonders in the Sky, and congratulate you and Chris Abeck on writing it, because it's a fascinating procedure, and I hope this hasn't been too painful, and you'll come back and see us sometime.
It's a pleasure, and please give my warm regards to Richard.
I will do that. Thank you very much, Jacques.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Bob.
it.